The Bible doesn't just mention giants. It describes entire lineages that terrified ancient Israel and shaped biblical history. And it all begins with the mysterious word found in Genesis 6:4, Nephilim. There were giants in the earth in those days. These beings appear before the flood during a time when corruption filled the earth. The text gives only a glimpse, but that glimpse was enough to shape thousands of years of discussion. The Nephilim were the original giants, the prototype, the ones whose presence is connected to a world descending into violence. But the story doesn't end there. After the flood, giants reappear, and the Bible names entire giant clans. When the Israelite spies explored Canaan in Numbers 13:33, they reported seeing the Anakim, and they said, "We saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants." The Anakim were literally described as descendants of the Nephilim. These were the giants so fearsome that Israel said, "We were in our own sight as grasshoppers." The Anakim weren't mythic. They were a documented enemy Israel was terrified to face. But there was yet another giant race, the Rephaim. In Deuteronomy 2:11, Moses writes that the Rephaim were giants the Moabites feared, and they compared them to the Anakim. These weren't just tall people. These were entire nations of giant warriors. The land around Bashan, Ammon, and Moab was known as the land of the Rephaim. Ancient Israel avoided their territory because of how formidable they were. Even in death, the Rephaim show up in Scripture as shadowy figures associated with the underworld, mentioned in places like Isaiah and Psalms. Their name became synonymous with the spirits of the dead, adding another layer of mystery to their identity. And then comes the most famous giant in the Old Testament era, Og, king of Bashan, the last survivor of the Rephaim. Deuteronomy 3:11 describes his bed as 9 cubits long, over 13 feet, a detail placed in Scripture to emphasize just how massive he was. Og ruled Bashan, a region loaded with ancient megalithic structures, giant-sized tombs, and locations that later Jewish tradition associated with the gateway to the underworld. When Israel defeated Og, it wasn't just a military victory. It was a symbolic conquest over an old, dark stronghold tied to the ancient giant clans. And finally, in the days of King Saul and King David, giants appear again. The giants of Gath, including the most famous, Goliath, described in 1 Samuel 17 as a warrior over 9 feet tall. But Goliath wasn't alone. The Scripture records giant relatives, Lami, Ishbi-benob, and another warrior described as having 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. These giants were remnants of the ancient Anakim in Philistine territory, survivors of older giant bloodlines. So when people say the Nephilim, they often imagine one group. But the Bible describes multiple generations and multiple tribes of giants across hundreds of years. The Nephilim before the flood, the Anakim after the flood, the Rephaim in Canaan and Bashan, of Bashan, the last king of the Rephaim, and the giants of Gath, including Goliath and his brothers. And they didn't appear in random places. They appeared in the very territories God commanded Israel to conquer, the regions tied to ancient spiritual rebellion. These giant clans weren't just physically intimidating. Biblically, they represented opposition to God's people, corruption of the land, and the lingering memory of a world before the flood, a world filled with violence, pride, and spiritual rebellion. When you track the giant narratives through Scripture, you realize it isn't just about size. It's about symbolism. Giants stand for everything that opposes God's purpose. Ancient strongholds, massive obstacles, spiritual resistance, and enemies that look impossible to defeat. And over, God brings his people against them to show one truth. No enemy is too great when God is the one who fights for you.